begin with our next session. Before that, the usual reminders. Please keep your cell phone on silent, and if you must take an urgent call, please do so outside the venue. Please do not leave your bags unattended. The festival is unable to take any responsibility for loss. Please ensure your phones are placed on silent mode. Again, very, very important. And we would be grateful if you give up your seats for those who may not be able to stand. Most importantly, please keep the aisles free for your own safety and security. Without further ado, we begin with the next session, which is titled Longform. Our speakers, who we are delighted to invite here today, are Alex Shoumatoff, Raghu Karnad, Mary Brenner, and they will be moderated by Jonathan Shainin. We will also have Atul Gawande join us shortly, which is now. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning with the next session. Thank you.
We saved a chair for you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Charbagh. We are here today to discuss Longform. I'm joined on stage. I'm Jonathan Shainin. I am joined on stage all the way to the left there by Raghu Karnad, who is the author of Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War, and the former editor of Time Out Delhi. Next to Raghu is Marie Brenner, who is the author of 6 books, is a writer at large for Vanity Fair, formerly a staff writer at New York Magazine and at The New Yorker. Alex Shoumatoff there in the middle, who began as a staff writer at The New Yorker and has since 1986 been a writer for Vanity Fair and is finishing his 11th book. Do I have that right? And next to me is Atul Gawande, who is, among other things, a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston.
You're doing this from memory.
Yes, a MacArthur Fellow, a professor at the Harvard Medical School, and also a staff writer at The New Yorker. So welcome to everyone. So there are many different words and phrases that have been deployed to try to describe the kind of writing that we're here to talk about. Long form seems to be the current fashion. Some people call these long reads. Some people call it literary journalism, as if to imply that ordinary journalism is anything but literary. Some people call it creative nonfiction. Truman Capote called his books nonfiction novels, I believe. But I sort of fall back on the American Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's definition of pornography when he said, "I know it when I see it." So I think all of us here have a sense of what this writing is, and often we say, to shorthand it, that it's like the sort of writing one reads in the New Yorker or Vanity Fair. So luckily we have these people here on stage. What I thought we would do as a way of starting off this panel would be to have each person talk a bit about one story they've written, as a way of kind of giving you a sense of the sort of work that goes into these stories and what it is exactly that makes them distinctive. So I'm going to begin with Atul, who's sitting right next to me here, who's going to talk about a story which I think, was it 2009 that it came out?
Which one was it that I sent you?
The McAllen, Texas story.
The McAllen, Texas one, yes.
So Atul, who, as I've said, is a surgeon and goes to McAllen, Texas, which for reasons he sets out to discover, has the highest healthcare costs of any place in the United States. So tell us about going to McAllen, Texas, and what you found there.
First was the decision to go to McAllen, Texas. So it had turned out that there is 30 years, 40 years of data from the Dartmouth College where they've been studying healthcare costs, and people have been describing dots on the map of where in the United States are the most expensive places. And lots of academics have dived into trying to understand what is going on in these places. And it struck me as a very New Yorker thing. Why not go there and see what you can find? And McAllen, Texas is the most expensive place for healthcare in the United States, which makes it the most expensive place for healthcare in the world. They spend, for people over 65, $17,000 per person per year on healthcare. The median income in the town is $12,000. So it is more than 100% of the town GDP per capita spent on healthcare. And the puzzle was, why? Do they have something better that they get out of it? And the question that I wanted to unfurl was both a data question. So I approached a bunch of academics to tell me what the numbers were telling, but then I would bring the numbers to the doctors and to the patients and to the insurance administrators locally and the heads of the hospitals and say, is this you? Does this sound like you? Is this, and explain why this is. And to a surprising extent, often what people say is, well, the data's wrong, it's incorrect, and they didn't. And the story then got to unfold from there was just by, I was bringing you along on this question of, if you could go to the most expensive place for healthcare on earth, what would you find, and what would the people there say about being in that place?
Well, I think actually this leads us into, the purpose of this panel is not to define long-form writing, but maybe we'll have a go at it. That you said there, it's a very New Yorker thing to pick up and go there, right? To sort of, the idea being that the story is out there in the world, and you've got to go find it and tell it. And you think if you hadn't gone there,
it was not a meaningful story without going there. I mean, I think the New York Times would have gone there, that there's a different approach that the New York Times might have taken. They would have had a single argument. It would have been a lead argument. And I was allowed to unfurl all kinds of themes. Fraud. That would have been the New York Times lead. The fraud that was there, and there was fraud, wasn't the lead story to me. To me, the lead story was how the ordinary doctor there was someone who routinely ordered 2 to 3 times as many tests as in El Paso, Texas, where they had half the costs and on measures of quality, even better outcomes of care. So what is going on when you're ordering twice as many pacemakers? You're a surgeon and you're twice as likely to operate on a gallstone, and what are your internal beliefs? And that goes farther, and you have to use the techniques of literature in many ways. Understand people's stories, where you come from, how you ended up here, and what are all the forces, yes, economic, but also the culture of the community, where the business of medicine, how you make money on medicine, had supplanted the calling and profession of medicine.
And would it be fair to say that this story had an unusual impact?
Yeah. So I did not expect a variety of things, becoming persona non grata in that town.
So you can't go back to McAllen, Texas?
Well, I can now, but it's taken a little while. Did not expect that President Obama would read it and have a cabinet session around how do we solve this problem, and it influenced some of the elements of the Obamacare Affordable Care Act. But I think the most important thing was how it brought out this discussion in the medical community about the fact that every one of us is conflicted, that we all make money on our patients, and there's always a choice you can make that makes you more money versus the choice you make that is the right thing to do. And we all feel that conflict, and seeing that emerge in discussions among the public and the profession was the most exciting, unexpected thing.
I'm going to move to Alex now, and I'm going to ask you about a story you wrote for Vanity Fair called The Agony and the Ivory. And this is a story about the ivory trade. And I want you to begin by just talking about how much traveling you did to write this piece, right? You told me you went to 9 countries.
Yes, in 6 weeks. Before I just quickly, do you know Jeff Tabin, the eye surgeon?
Oh, no, I don't know Jeff Tabin, the eye surgeon.
I did. Was in Ethiopia with him in May. He did 2,300 cataract surgeries in 12 days for $20 a piece, and the same operation in the U.S. cost $3,000. Right. So what does that tell you? Right there. So let's get to The Agony and Ivory, which was published in the June 2012 issue of Vanity Fair, and you can find it on my website, dispatchesfromthevanishingworld.com. And it came about in a very funny way because the son of Christo, the great outdoor installation guy, Cyril Christo, is a fanatic elephant lover, as most elephant lovers are, and he'd been calling Vanity Fair, you've got to do something about the elephants. 30,000 a year are being killed in Africa. And, finally he got the ear of the secretary of my editor. And I came in looking for a story, and they said, can you please get this guy off my back? And that's how I got the assignment. So I went.
So hang on. I would think ordinarily you'd have to do a lot of convincing to get them to send you off to 9 countries in Africa.
Well, it was just an idea whose time had come, and none of us realized how many elephant lovers there are out there, and this piece went absolutely viral, and it started this movement to stop the slaughter of African elephants and the consumption of ivory, mainly by China, which is still ongoing, but Hong Kong, the biggest market, has just banned the importing and sale of ivory. Big victory. And but the slaughter continues.
And where did your travels take you to? So you went to Africa, obviously, but you also went to places where the ivory is being bought and consumed.
Well, I started with an elephant in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, called Bubbles, who was a 28-year-old ivory orphan that has been raised since the age of 2 by this animal trainer. You can read all this. And I just spent a couple of days with Bubbles. We swam in the intercoastal waterway. We went into the myrtle forest, and he loved myrtle. And I saw him 14 months later, and he'd seen thousands of people in the interim, and he immediately recognized me out of this crowd of people, and he took me, he lifted his leg so I could sit on his lap, and gave me this big hug, which Doc Antle, that I said that he'd only seen that happen 3 times before, so he remembered me better than the Dalai Lama, I have to say, who I had 2 hours with back in 1990, and then a couple of years later I saw him again. It was a seminal encounter for me, but he didn't remember me at all. So then I went to this guy in Seattle who was, he's studying from elephant dung, reconstructing the DNA of different populations so that when ivory is confiscated, they can know where it's coming from.
And was it dangerous to be reporting from places where elephants are being hunted for their ivory, right? I mean, I'm assuming people there are not eager to be, have outside journalists wandering around with pen and paper writing about what they're doing?
Right. Well, the piece starts in Amboseli Park in Kenya, where we go out and see the carcass of this poached elephant. So the poachers had already taken the tusk. The face of this elephant had been completely hacked out. It was like a Francis Bacon silent scream painting, the most horrible and distressing thing I've ever seen. I've seen human corpses, but this was just really horrible. And then we went back into the park. This was outside of the park in one of the Maasai group ranches, and we saw these elephants just eating placidly. And so I never had any direct encounters with poachers, but I got to places where they'd just been, in a number of places.
And you said that this was a story that after it came out, it had a big impact, and there was a sense in which there was a movement that was kicked into gear. Do you think it was because of the, is it something about the length or the power of this kind of story that really, takes off with readers, that if you'd written a short news item about ivory poachers, you wouldn't have had the same kind of impact?
This was a big piece, 12,000 words, and I really put all of the literary skills that I've ever had, because I wanted people to realize what was happening and to care about it. And I can explain what I did. If you read the piece, it should be self-evident, but there's some little techniques that I used, and it worked. And that's the great thing about Vanity Fair, is that I've had this experience a number of times. You are either riding the wave that is cresting in the zeitgeist, and sometimes you're even able to make it happen, which was the case with this elephant piece.
Well, this seems to apply equally well, Marie, to the story that I wanted to ask you to talk about, which I think when it was published was called The Man Who Knew Too Much. No, I think
Trouble with mics earlier. We were having trouble here. Mics? No.
I don't think. Do we have another? Do we have a backup mic here?
Is there a mic
Or you could.
working?
Oh,
Thank
Okay.
you so much. Oh,
all right.
thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. It is such a thrill to be in Jaipur. We were talking earlier, India is my favorite country in the world, and I come as often as I can, and I'm often I'm so inspired when I get here by the absolute energy of this incredible place and at the Jaipur Festival. I am drawn to characters who are caught up in unimaginable circumstances. And no story was more compelling for me than telling the story of the whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand, a chemist at the Brown & Williamson Tobacco Company, who discovered that the tobacco company was poisoning the cigarettes with certain kinds of additives. This story began as a 2-sentence item in the Daily News in New York. We knew so little about this man. We called him Jeffrey Wigand. The TV show 60 Minutes had done a profile of Wigand that had been canceled because of CBS's fear of taking on the tobacco company. And our editor, Graydon Carter, circled it, said to me, "This has got an incredible amount of backstory of the network. Let's go tell the story of the network." I went out, I could find nothing about Jeffrey Wigand. No one knew anything about him, but I came back a day later having spoken to some tobacco activists, and we discussed, forget what went on at the network, let's find out what makes a whistleblower have the courage to take on a corporation that is trying to shut his voice. What happened then was, about, as Alex and Atul described, a long, endless penetration, trying to penetrate, this was the days of faxes, sending faxes. If you've seen the movie The Insider that was made from The Man Who Knew Too Much, you saw those faxes going back and forth. The story for me broke through several months later when I was down in Louisville, hoping that I could get this now math teacher because he had been fired by the corporation. His wife was threatening to leave him. What I did not know was that he was suicidal, that he was in fear of his life. Another death threat came from the Brown & Williamson Corporation, allegedly, and he was thrown out of his house by his wife. He had nowhere to go, and I got a frantic call from the CBS producer, Lowell Bergman, played by Al Pacino in The Insider, to say, "Jeffrey doesn't have a place to go. Can you hide him at your hotel?" So I had the absolute pleasure and the excitement of calling Graydon Carter and saying, "You're not going to believe who I've got under an assumed name at the Hyatt Hotel." And what was it? And it was Jeffrey Wigand. And so that is how the reporting began, of hearing his life story.
I want to ask you, before you go further, what your first meeting with him was like.
He was a terrified man. He was teary. He was so frightened. Of course, you cannot be a person who tells the truth of what's going on in a powerful company without having certain complex traits, including a lot of rage. This is a very deeply intelligent and moral person who saw just corporate bigfooting, corporate profiteering, the company not caring that children were possibly getting addicted. And so our first meeting was fraught because he's a man who had just lost his family, potentially, getting a divorce. He didn't know how he was going to support himself. But what was incredible about this first meeting was it was in a room, and you can see a sort of a scene of this in The Insider, where we looked at the Hyatt Hotel from my room directly into the offices of the Brown & Williamson company across the street, so that we could see the lawyers inside Brown & Williamson as we were a street away in a big high-rise. And you see this in Michael Mann's incredible film of that moment where he's looking and he's seeing in the Brown & Williamson company.
And what was the impact of this story then, apart from the fact that it was made into a fantastic movie?
Well, you know, films have, I think, a hyper reality. The impact of the story was for me on my particular desire as a reporter was to tell more of these stories, more and more, and it's to go in through individuals. You know, for me, an individual is really the story. Like like we say in journalism, give me the story of Anne Frank, we'll give you the story of World War II. And so I try to find people who swim under large dramas that are going on in the society, and I try to spend a lot of time with them to go inside their minds. The impact on tobacco politics really came when Michael Mann and Eric Roth did this stunning movie, The Insider, which, you know, took what was journalism, what was a form of long-form journalism, 18,000 words, and they morphed it into, you know, such a powerful movie. So I really stand on their shoulders.
But it's interesting because it is the case that these stories, I mean, one way that I describe this sometimes to writers when I'm asking for a little more scene is, you know, give me something cinematic here,
Yes.
right? Make us feel. So there is a sort
Yes.
of almost affinity between these two forms.
Absolutely, and you know, you're on to something, Jonathan, because I started my career, I went to film school. I went to NYU Film School, and I thought I was going to be a screenwriter, and I started my career working for a movie studio and then publishing a novel. So when I'm interviewing a subject, I'm much more personality driven, and I often think in scenes, and I'll make a box on my notes around something in my notes. Oh, that's a scene, that's a scene, that's a scene. So I think in scenes.
I'm going to transition here, Raghu, and I'm going to ask you to be the spokesperson for Indian long-form journalism as we move into a more broad consideration of the form. Lots of people say, as Alex just said to me, oh, I hear there's a boom in long-form here in India. What do you think of that proposition?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be your sock puppet, but I do think that a lot of it has to, that you get a lot of credit for it. And the story that I want to talk about is, that I will eventually talk about, is one that was published in Caravan and edited by you. But before I say that, I want to say that it's a huge privilege for me to be on this panel. Don't entirely feel like I deserve it, so I'll try and keep it short. So certainly the story that I wrote for you was something that would been practically impossible to publish even a few years prior, I think. I think that the course of...
I should step in and describe this. This was a story published in Caravan called City in a Bottle that was a history of the politics of liquor in Bangalore and the way that the sort of history of the city of Bangalore couldn't be told without liquor in its various forms.
Yeah.
And it was kind of partially reporting, partially history, partially essay, and, you know, very much, you're right, the kind of thing that previously there wouldn't have been a place for.
Right. So in my life of writing longer stories, I had written some, I suppose they were long-form reported stories from the field for Tehelka, and I think Tehelka had a role in sort of building out that space. I reported from Nandigram and from Bhopal. But the longest and the most interesting was this story. It was only enabled by the fact that Caravan was publishing pieces upwards of 10,000 words. So yes, it has two premises. One is that Bangalore has a divided identity. It's really always has been split between a colonial cantonment and a vernacular city. And the other is that Bangalore is a city in which the liquor industry has great, has great influence and very great extent, and has power in political lobbies, and it is also divided along similar lines, and sort of becomes manifests as rival industries and rival drinking cultures, and having this long form space allowed me to discover that this wasn't just a story about political lobbying and about excise manipulation, but actually it was a story that about architecture and cultural patronage, and about cinema and the emergence of Kannada cinema, about newspapers, and all of the places into which the capital generated by India's largest liquor manufacturers spread through the city, and the ways that those cultural fields then reproduced and reinforced these two separate identities in the city. So there's certainly a very direct link between the format and the potential of, and I think the richness of the story there.
I want to turn to Atul here because the rest of us, I think, have spent our entire careers largely as journalists, and you had a career first as a surgeon and continue to have a career as a surgeon, but began writing journalism. So when you sit down to do a story of this length, how do you approach it? What is the, when you talk to your editor, you come up with an idea for something, what's the, in your view, what is it that's distinctive about this style of writing, particularly as someone who doesn't do journalism otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, as we were talking, I mean, I don't think my approach is likely to be any different than theirs. You want a subject that's meaty enough that you want to dig in and you feel like that you have the scent of an important story. You often don't know where it goes. I suspect you didn't know how deep Jeffrey Wygant would go, or the Ivory story would take you as far as it does, but love the chance to have something that's worth sinking your teeth into, and having an editor. In all of our cases here, we're describing relationships with editors where they are willing to give you the rope to go out after that idea. And I think a lot about rhythms. Like, one of the questions that I'd love to hear the others about is, why writing at this length as opposed to a book, and why writing in this way instead of film? We've referred to film and the power of it. And for me, the answer is that unfolding through characters is, and dealing with often very abstract, complex ideas, where film tends to be reductive, and there's certain things film can do. So what I'm thinking about is, I want the video, I have a complex idea, and I want to understand, how do I turn it into a visual piece inside the piece? Where am I going to go? Where am I going to see it unfold? Who can carry the weight of the story? And so the beginning for me is just tons of research. I'd say 2/3 of the time and hours going in is research rather than writing, and about 1/3 is the writing. And then I think a lot about rhythms. I think a daily newspaper journalist or a surgeon has a rhythm of, you like a problem you can solve in 3 hours.
Right.
Like, I don't want a surgical problem that takes me 3 months. Right. Like, I like solutions that are 3 hours and I'm done. But this kind of writing is about 6 months. And it's got to be worth digging in for 6 months, give or take 3 months. And I say it because my editor, Henry Finder, is in the crowd somewhere here. And I'm more than 6 months on the piece we're supposed to be working on, and I know that. But I will get it done. And I research to the point of overload. I think I love the research more than anything because it's taking you in different directions. But then you finally have to start writing it, and the person that emerges or the place that emerges and how you start and where you dig in. McAllen was one of my fastest pieces. It wrote itself because the premise was so readily vivid. I had a piece on solitary confinement, and I knew I wanted to understand how many prisoners were in solitary confinement in the United States. Turns out that it's 10 times more than under Reagan, and that we are the country with the largest number of people in long-term solitary confinement in the world. And it wasn't something that was near to my experience, and so I didn't figure out how to get in. And I ended up writing about hostages who had been in solitary confinement, trying to say, why do we think it's torture when a hostage is confined versus when someone else is? And so, I ended up trying to interview journalists who'd been held hostage, and then prisoners who'd been in solitary confinement, and what's the difference in the science. So you can tell, I just love the research. The writing is more painful.
Well, it almost feels to me like a lot of these stories start with a question, and you're trying to find the question whose answer is going to take 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 words. I wanted to ask Marie about how you know when you have a story. What's the start like? What is the conversation with your editor like? What's that early stage where you're trying to figure out, does this have enough gas, petrol, I suppose I should say, that it's going to carry through?
This is a great question. My passion for storytelling starts with anger, or seeing a name in the press, or learning about a character who, again, is caught up in something that just I have to solve. Who this man is, who the woman is, what their life was. Most recently, I've been writing about a Jewish police commissioner in Paris who has been fighting terrorism and anti-Semitism for the last 12 years. And just before the attacks in France in January, I read that Sami Ghazlan, this commissioner who I'd written about a decade ago, had made the decision to move to Israel. And I thought this was so stunning. I saw it in a small little news item. And I knew Ghazlan, who lived out in this gritty working class neighborhood. He is a former police commissioner, and that he had made it his life. He set up the most important hotline to report all of these episodes that were happening to the Jews of France that you've all been reading about. And I thought, my God, if Sami Ghazlan, a cop, you know, the crime fighter, would be like if one of our top police commissioners says, I can't take it anymore, I'm going to leave my country. And I just began pestering my editor, and our editor, Graydon Carter, saying, you must let me go do this. And finally, he relented.
And what does it take with your editors? What's the thing that snaps where they, all of a sudden, the light bulb goes off in their head and they think, yes, I see it, you can do this?
This is a great mystery, and I hope that you'll be able to solve it for all of us, what it is that gets them to say yes to these impossible ideas we have.
But you said anger.
Yeah, so
and was
anger,
it
so my
anger or was
anger
it
is,
confusion about what? Was it the puzzle or was it the
it's
anger?
outrage. Outrage is my, you know, why does this fantastic person that I know to be a deeply committed Frenchman, a person who cares so passionately about his country, what outrage is going on in this country that is causing him to give up and move to Israel? Why? Why is he feeling so frightened? And it's, you know, in the same with, this is what happened with Jeffrey Wigand, or underneath most of the stories I write, whether it's lawyers fighting people, the sugar barons of America, whether it's coming over to try to understand from an American point of view what happened here during 26/11 and finding a under police commissioner who was wrongly blamed by his superiors. You know, I'm trying to find that person that embodies for my readers and for me that sense of mystery and outrage.
Alex, let me ask you, sort of taking off from what Maria is just saying, how do you find that character, right? It seems to me that something that a lot of these stories have in common, not all of them, is that there are characters who are really alive for the reader. Some of you will remember Larry Wright was here about 5 years ago, and he said this unforgettable thing that when he writes his books, he thinks of his characters as donkeys, because if you find the right ones, you can load them up with information and they'll carry it through the story for you.
Yeah.
So how do you find just the right character when you're setting out to write a story?
Well, on not all of my pieces, but some of them, and the two that were made into movies were the Diane Fossey, who was killed trying to and saving the guerrillas. They wouldn't
this
be
became
here.
Gorillas in the Mist, yes.
Yes. And then Chico Mendes, the guy who was the leader of the rubber tappers in the Amazon, who was killed in 1988. And so, you know, Diane Fossey was a very complex person. So I talked to, you know, the people she worked with, the next generation of guerrilla people. And, you know, it was a very, you know, an enormous process to try and put together who this person was who I didn't really know. And same with Chico Mendes, who was not such a complicated guy. He was sort of recruited by the international environmental movement who needed a Brazilian collaborator. Actually, he was the head of the Rubber Tappers Union, and he was, you know, a social activist, not an environmentalist. But they gave him the Goldman Award and made him into a great environmentalist. But, you know, there's another piece that I did not long ago about Cornelius Gurlitt, the urban hermit in Munich who lived for 50 years with $1 billion of stolen Nazi art. And that was really interesting. And
how do you, tell me, I mean, with Fossey and Mendes, these are people who are deceased by the time you're writing about them.
Yeah.
With something like this, Cornelius, is it Gurlitt? Am I saying that
Gurlitt,
right?
yeah.
How do you, what is it that ticks off that light in your head that says, I've got to go and write about this guy? How do you, is it something you come across a two-line thing in the newspaper, or?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And in my case, it's often the Montreal Gazette, And actually, I think that my editor, I was in Borneo, so he emailed you, said, as soon as you finish with Borneo, we want you to go to Munich. So it wasn't my idea in that case. But let me just return to your point about why do we like to write long-form journalism instead of books? Because they reach many more people. Vanity Fair has a circulation of over 1 million, and I'm doing stuff for Smithsonian, which also has a circulation of over 1 million, but it's a different audience.
And you think it's maybe that you're closer to the reader somehow when you're writing at this length. You're at a length that's you're capable to do a kind of storytelling that's beyond a news story.
Right,
but you're not asking for the level of commitment that comes with a book. You're not saying to someone, okay, give me a couple weeks of your life.
Yeah, something you can do in one long sitting. And so my whole interest now is to reach, I'm sort of have dedicated whatever writing skills I have to the service of the planet and all the embattled life fellow creatures and indigenous cultures. So I want to reach people to make them care so that we can do something. I'm just doing something about giraffes. And I just spent 3 weeks with 1,000 Rothschild giraffes in Uganda, and nobody knows. I mean, how many of you know that the giraffes have been cut from 140,000 to 80,000 in the last 15 years? And nobody really knows what's going on inside the mind of a giraffe either, and they're really amazing.
Well, do you think,
So-
Raghu, in this kind of, Alex is talking about these environmental or kind of, natural scandals, so to speak, and we're here in a country that has no shortage of these things, and you talked about, you've written from Bhopal. Do you think there's a real appetite here for bringing these, the newspapers are full of these things all the time, but is there something about this genre that has the capability of bringing pollution, environmental damage, riots, all of these things to light in a way? I mean, it does seem to me, and I perhaps slightly self-interestedly, that there has been a real hunger for this kind of writing in India in a way, partially because it didn't exist quite in that way previously. And so, my experience was that you had a generation of people who loved to read The New Yorker and loved to read Vanity Fair, but almost never read stories about their own country in those magazines.
Right. Well, I actually think that as the news cycle has sped up and sped up and sped up over here, the hunger for something that remains after the dust settles has actually increased. To talk right back to you about what Caravan does, Caravan provides a very valuable service of sort of reviewing what happens in stories. You might be familiar with various parts of them, but no one can be on top of the complete sort of account of what happens in say a national scandal or in the career of a major political personality. Unless they're doing it full time, then a long form story can come and do that for you. And more importantly, I think it can also long form also has space for those things that make a story emotionally sort of resonant in a way that that shorter news stories don't, and therefore can communicate through that as well and can hold readers' attention. Long form story is sort of like, I think a decent analogy is like a long-term relationship. You need to put in some time and some focus, and you need to be there and stick around, but it gives you back something in terms of depth and resonance. And that I definitely see a certain potential for environmental stories there. In my experience with the story of Bhopal, what was happening was that there was a Padyatra, which is a foot protest, a protest march from Bhopal all the way to Delhi that was being conducted by some of the victims of the gassing and of the poisoned water table that remains. It's a powerful thing to see people who have very profound health issues marching a distance that you would never imagine marching in the early summer in North India. And some of that needed to be present in order to make anyone even think about revisiting the the problem of Bhopal that still lies there, sort of festering right there in the Union Carbide compound. Of course, I did manage to get into the compound and find glimmering black pools of tar, which are actually toxic waste that was dumped and buried on site back at that time, for which no one is willing to take responsibility because it's a liability to even dispose of it. And so I think that, environmental stories, though I haven't written too many of them myself, set up certain extra challenges that political stories and stories about violence and conflict do not, in terms of engaging the reader. And long form gives you space in which to use the emotional tools and the stylistic tools to throw those hooks out.
Can I try jumping in on a little bit?
Yeah, please.
I mean, one thing that I'm attracted to is that the short news pieces have a life of about a day or two.
Yeah.
The long form pieces, when they're, to me, the best ones are what are lasting and cool. They have a life that can be years long, certainly are read for quite a while, and even now they're talking about stories that we remember and go back now a decade and more. And that capacity from something that you could produce in 6 months is really something. Like, I will hopefully get to write, I have 4 books under my belt, and I hope I might have 8 to 10 before I leave this world. That would be fantastic. But I'm able to I have about 60 in long form, and I might have 100 to 120, I hope, along the way. And that capacity to dig in on major social issues that really matter, put life behind them and some drama, and see it have resonance and ripples in the pond in a way that just those daily stories do not do. I think it occupies a certain space. And I'd say also that about film. Doing a documentary or doing a fictional film, they also have immense power, but they can only tackle some of the stories. They take years to make, and the capacity you have from being on the pulse, but ahead of it at a little bit more of a remove, is a really special place to be, and I think is a sense of the cycle of time that your brain has to occupy and you have to enjoy.
Well, I was about to say that I think there's a recognition in the journalism business, perhaps belatedly after, for a long time there was a sense that the internet was going to wipe out this way of writing. And I think now people have come to realize that, in fact, on the internet there is a, tidal wave of undifferentiated content, and these stories, which are so unique and so powerful, actually cut through that, and they stick around, and we now have, they go viral. I was going to ask Marie, who looks like she's about to say something anyway, about the paradox that this is at a moment when the cost of these things is getting to be harder and harder for people to bear. So it is the sort of best of times and the worst of times.
Absolutely, and it's a kind of very interesting, fraught, complex moment in long-form journalism and all of reporting as media is getting redefined. But to add on to this very interesting question of what long-form brings to a reader, in long-form you are able to do something which you cannot do on a daily news story, or usually on the web, which is to bring emotion and psychology and what your characters were thinking at critical dramatic moments of a news event. And for me, this is so incredible to be able to sit for hours, and it can take hours and sometimes days and sometimes months to penetrate the psychological state of the characters, and they become, and we use the same terms in long-form journalism, although we're reporting facts and we are fact-checked very carefully, and there can be no deviation from anything that feels like truthiness. It cannot be allowed with our lawyers and fact-checking rigor, but to be able to penetrate their minds and to have them recreate their emotional states at these extraordinary moments, like when the Taj was being under siege by the terrorists, when their police commissioners here were refusing to send in the troops. What was this young police commissioner, Vishwas Patel, thinking, trapped in this hotel by himself with the terrorists and the Taj security guard? You cannot do this in a newspaper. You have to have editors that will spend the thousands of dollars to allow you to take the time and do what we called as long-form journalism was really exploding in the 1960s and 70s. This is what was called famously the hang around interview.
But let me ask you, because you have to make a living, right? At Caravan and other, how do you answer your own question?
How do I answer my own question?
How does it stay alive financially in India or elsewhere?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think it stays alive.
You haven't figured it out yet?
No, I think it stays alive because people, wherever you are, I think people realize that there is a distinct value to this, and I think, Caravan, I don't know if Anant Nath, who's the editor-in-chief, is here, very much modeled itself after the New Yorker, and I think the idea there was that in the same way that the New Yorker and Vanity Fair put a proposition to the reader, which is that, you're going to get very deep, very detailed, very definitive, and very entertaining stories every time you buy this magazine. I think Caravan came with that same hopeful promise that, there's an audience out there of people who want to have this reading experience, right? I mean, I think I now work at The Guardian where I am, do a similar thing, and we publish 3 5,000-word articles every week, and they're all free on our website like everything else at The Guardian, and they go in the newspaper. And there, I think what you have, much like at these other magazines, is someone in the management has a commitment and says, look, this is a unique thing that we can offer readers, and if we put together enough quality material, people will come and read it.
It's a lost leader, though.
Yeah, it is a lost leader, but I think it's kind of, but you could, I think say that most of what a newspaper does, right, reporting the news is not cheap, right? So the same kind of problem occurs there, I think.
It's also, long form is also effectively the status journalism that I think a lot of anyone with the resources might be tempted to push those resources in that direction wherever there's a surplus. For instance, Caravan just happens to have a backer in the form of a publishing house that publishes lots of faster moving domestic magazines, I guess.
Yeah.
And they found the resources to do something that.
I mean, I think what's happened in journalism more broadly, which all of us have experienced, is that, it used to be that owning a magazine or owning a newspaper was like a license to print money, right? If you go back, if you look at the New Yorker archives, or I'm sure the Vanity Fair archives, you'll read these New Yorker issues from the 1970s, and they're like,
ads.
well, an article will take 30 pages because it'll be like almost entirely ads throughout the whole thing. And I think everyone has seen that, ad spend shrink, but there is still a sense that it's worth it. I just think my sense is that everyone is a bit more cost conscious than they used to be, right? Alex can tell us about, what it was like at the New Yorker in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
When I think there was probably not a lot of worry about, how long a trip was going to take or how much money it was going to cost.
No, and there were no assignments. Old Mr. Sean just kind of said, well, we're interested in whatever you're interested in. And of course, I was interested in everything, so I took full advantage, and we were paid by the word, so there was little initiative to be concise, to make every word tell, as Strunk and White, the elements of style, asked us. But let me just go back to this idea. First of all, I want to say that every morning I get today's 5 long pieces online from the New Yorker, and they're absolutely right, about things that happened yesterday. Sarah Palin endorsing Donald Trump, that sort of thing. So that it really is alive and well, and I know that unless those are from that week's magazine, which most of them aren't, the guys that write them, who are often New Yorker writers, do not get paid a lot. So it is a problem. But the 12, let's say, now it's the long form is getting shorter. 5,000 words is long now. Right. I can barely clear my throat in 5,000 words.
That's just the first scene in the box.
Right. But if you can't tell a story in 12,000 words, you should maybe think of another profession, because that's plenty.
Jonathan's turning green here, telling his writers, if you can't tell this story in 5,000 words, you don't do it for the crowd.
But the fact is that those pieces, as we're all sort of saying, the silent transmission of the written word, I think, is the most powerful transmission of all. If it's really well written, and it just goes really deep inside of you. More, it's interesting because the foundation that has supported my website, I went to them and said, well, listen, we want to do a TV show, which is what I do, called Suitcase on the Loose, where I go around and do all these things. And, you know, good stories that do some good for the world. And the woman who has the foundation said, I'm sorry, Alex, but we have no evidence that TV or movies have any impact, so we don't support it. So I said, wait a minute, you know. And so then, you know, a couple of months later, my wife and I, she comes home exhausted from her work as a social worker, and I'm exhausted from my writing and all the other things I do. And we just sort of collapse in front of the TV and we turn on whatever is on. And honestly, you know, some days we look at this movie and we're halfway through it and we say, God, didn't we see that one yesterday? So, you know, there is something to that. And yet there are really, really powerful movies that, you know, that leave a lifetime. And
Well,
I think The Insider was a really powerful.
I think the power of the written word is a good note for us to end on. So I think we're going to throw it to questions from the crowd here. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left from what I can tell.
Hi. How do you decide as writers when to end your piece? When you're writing, you know, 10,000 or 15,000, how and when do you decide that this is it and this is all the story requires?
I'm going to give this one to Marie for sake of, I'll do the.
You know, that's a very good question. This is really complicated, but it's a question of hearing moments. You hear a moment, that moment in a scene or in a chronology where you know, oh, this is extraordinary. In my last story about the Jewish police commissioner and he moving to Israel, I had an amazing moment reporting where I learned that the French security detail appeared at his house with the new tenants in it, and the tenants told the French security police detail that were coming to protect him, I'm sorry, Commissioner Gazlan no longer lives here. And so, you know, there's your ending, so in the box. Yeah, it's a moment.
They used to call the final line of a story the kicker, right?
Yeah.
And I guess you're just looking for the line that does that.
There's a woman in the third row there on the aisle.
My question is for all of you. One of the conversations we've been having lately is that there's an economic barrier to access when you want to be a long-form writer.
An economic barrier.
Yeah, if you're a young journalist, you need to have parents who can support you for a few years while you write. If you're a seasoned writer, you need to have language and access to reading and other things. So do you believe long form can ever break both of these barriers, and what would sort of enable that? Will multimedia reporting do that, for example?
Everyone's looking at me.
Assign somebody.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, look, I think this is a problem that journalism more generally has, right? There's a situation in the West and in India that, you know, entry-level jobs in journalism are scarce. A lot of people get into journalism through, you know, internships that depend on family connections or that depend on being able to, again, to have support from your parents. You know, I mean, I think this is one of the things that's economically difficult about this kind of journalism because, in a way, for me as an editor, I'm asking the writer to do more work than they should. Right? This is kind of what all of us do, right? One way of thinking about how this long-form journalism works is that you could tell the story more simply, but you're not going to do it that way. You're going to take the extra time and figure out what's really going on and get to the bottom of things. And I think, you know, one thing that should happen, I suppose, is that the magazines or websites or whatever that want to support this kind of work, I think need to make provisions, whether those are through fellowships or awards or whatever, to allow young writers who don't necessarily have this experience to get some practice at it, because it's very hard.
Yeah.
I'll make 2 plugs.
Yeah.
One, you can become a surgeon first, so you have a living on the side.
Which your parents will be very pleased,
Yes.
I think I can say. Atul can confirm this.
But I do think it's not a great wave that there are more and more professors of various kinds who spend part of their time doing journalism, and it's like fiction, in that there are more and more professors of fiction writing who are, that's their way to keep it going. And it's a sign of where it's gone. I'm on the board of the New America Foundation, which is a model that I think has been working, which is that we provide fellowships of anywhere from $30,000 to $90,000 for people at various stages of their career to spend time on long-form articles or on books. And you know, it's amazing how among the things that we fund, that's the lowest cost item with the biggest payback, the most Pulitzer Prizes, the most impact of the, you know, we have a large area that does research and other things like that. And I think it's a model that now is spreading to different cities in the US, and I think it could spread to places like here, where you give people time and fellowship to develop that experience as young writers, take on new ideas, and it isn't all that costly in Indian finances either.
All right, I'm being told we're out of time, unfortunately. Oh, do we have time? All right.
Can I make one
You've already
point?
got the microphone. I can't stop you.
Okay, just, you know, as a journalist in India, for 20 years, I'm Sabha Naqvi, and with and in Outlook magazine. It's just not economically viable. Caravan, you can only do that. A person supported by their parents can do that. I'm astounded when I hear stories of somebody funding you to go to many African countries. You know, that's a dream world for an Indian journalist. If you're going to write for Caravan, you've got to have another source of income. And then you've got to have, I mean, it's not a viable way for anyone to earn a living. So that's all that I wanted to say.
That wasn't really
I
a
do want to
question
say that
exactly. But I think what you're missing here is that there is going to be in time the development of an audience that supports this kind of journalism. And as that audience matures, this kind of journalism is going to pay off. And I think, you know, that'll be to the benefit of everyone.
And
I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, everyone. I've never been heckled before.
Better than being a poet.